why don't
The point is here. Second half of the class.
no, I think we're going to have to evaluate John Rawls' class, but we can certainly talk about why do we have a right
See, Lewis says that the greatest injustice is beauty. I think so, yes.
well, that's
These factory workers, he goes, it's not better than one else here.
this is a lot of people, they're, lay capitalism condemning ugly.
Evaluations?
I don't think he really Engels.
No, they, who? No, he's well,
No. Okay, how about that? Well, as perhaps you notice on the sheet of topics that we had to go over, we're not going to be able to do everything, so I had to make some decision about how to cut it short. And I'll say something about that in a moment. But I think I'm going to resist the temptation to say more about the topic of Marx on justice that we have been talking about. We just have to leave it the way it was, somewhat, I'm afraid, suspended in midair. But I hope I was able to give some idea of the problems that it raises, and hope that you'll think about that, and undoubtedly there will be questions of that kind that you might be able to answer on the exam if you want to. Recall that these exam questions are given to you sometime during the reading period, so you'll be able to think about it. Well, I won't go into that now. I'll mention that on the Friday, the last day, so we'll go into that more now. The way I'm going to proceed is today, and it's always somewhat intimidating to go back to this topic after people have talked about, but anyway, I'm going to adhere to our schedule. I thought what I would do, you recall a while back, we discussed what I called the first fundamental comparison, and that was a comparison between the principle of justice and the principle of average utility. And in that connection, the particular problem was to try to show where, first of all, the equality of basic utilities came from and the priority. So one focus on that comparison as an attempt to show that, and we discussed what I call the argument from the original position with that general idea in mind. Now the outcome of that comparison is just that the two principles of justice would be adopted rather than the principle of average utility. That was the only principle in question. Now suppose that argument is correct, it would be chosen, or would be agreed to, that outcome, that fact does not give very much support to the difference principle itself. It only shows that the difference principle makes, let's say, more or less adequate provision for general all-purpose means, and I think of those as, say, income and wealth as a way to indexing. It makes adequate provision of these all-purpose means in order for people to enjoy their basic rights and liberties. But it may be that there are other principles that are superior on that count, so one ought to look into that. So in order to explore this question, what I propose to do on this handout, and I don't believe we'll be able to go all of it, but over all of it, but to give the general idea, is that we want to discuss a second fundamental comparison in which the two principles of justice are compared with other principles that are exactly the same, except that the different principle is replaced by the principle of average utility, that is, to maximize average utility over the members of society, subject to there being a suitable social minimum maintained. So that's the other principle in the comparison. So that this conception then requires that the principle of average utility be maximized subject to the constraints of these various three prior principles, as we might enumerate them. That is, the first principle of the equal liberties, principle of fair equality of opportunity, and this idea of there being an adequate social minimum maintained. And I will refer to this conception as the principle of constrained utility, which is constrained by all these other notions. Now, this conception that the two principles are being compared with, that makes, again, I think, a fundamental comparison, because if the two principles are favored in this case, then it would appear that they would be favored in any conception in which the principle of utility had a reasonably prominent place. You see, what we're doing is we first take a case that's fairly straightforward, where the emphasis falls on the equality and the priority in trying to maintain the basic liberties. And then we go to another comparison where we're now using it in this, that is, the principle of utility in a more restricted, constrained way. And if it noses out in that comparison too, then it would seem, and this isn't any rigorous argument, it's just something one can say, it would seem as if it's not going to be prominent in principles and conceptions of political justice. That's the idea of calling these two fundamental comparisons. Now, I want to say something about the nature of this argument at this point, and to make some comments about the publicity condition. Note that if we use the Maximin rule to organize the parties of deliberation in the second comparison, only the first and the third conditions of that rule obtain. Only first and second obtain. The first, you recall, was that we discount probabilities or estimates of probabilities because the parties don't have information about that. The second one was, of course, to look for the conception that had the highest security level. And the third, which does not hold, is to avoid those conceptions that have outcomes that are intolerable and altogether unacceptable. Now, suppose we agree that the third condition doesn't obtain in this second comparison, because by constraining the principle of utility by these three prior principles, the worst possibilities have been eliminated. So we can't argue in terms of all three together. So the result is that the argument turns mainly on the desirability of the two well-ordered societies. The first one corresponding to the two principles of justice, the second one corresponding to what I've called the principle of constrained utility. So we are to imagine that what the parties do is attempt to work out which of these well-ordered societies is preferable from the perspective of the original position. That's what they will be doing. And a lot of the considerations, of course, that we introduce are highly speculative, but that's inevitable on any view, in any case. So to fix ideas, let's suppose that the argument is presented in terms of three considerations. The first would be the requirement of publicity. The second is the idea of reciprocity, which is implicit in the idea of society as a system of fair cooperation. And thirdly would be the impossibility. I shan't give any very developed argument about this, but she just suggests the impossibility of specifying a workable conception of utility for a conception of political justice, and emphasizing political justice. There may be workable conceptions of for other purposes, perhaps say for the theory of the household or something like that in economics, but the idea is not for the purposes of political justice. And we'll take these kind of three conditions together, and I'll make some comments on the last point at the end. Next time, the thing I'll do on Friday is to introduce a fourth consideration, those that are based on the notion of self-respect. And in order to give some sense of that, I will develop the notion, in such as time allows, of the idea of society as a social union of social unions, and the way in which the two principles of justice help to make that possible. And in order to understand that, we suggest that you look at section 79, which is important to this, indeed all sections 78 and 9, and some of the latter sections in chapter 9, but particularly section 79. Now the principle of, the notion of publicity, you recall, is one of the formal conditions that's introduced and applies to all conceptions of political justice, as mentioned on page 133. Now, this constraint requires, or this formal condition requires the parties, when they are considering principles of justice, to assume that these principles belong to what I have throughout called a public conception of political justice, where by public I mean that all the principles are known and recognized by people, and we are concerned with, as always, political justice. So that the parties are to assume that all citizens accept and know that the others accept the same principles of justice, and that this knowledge is in turn publicly recognized. The parties are also to assume and ask themselves what will happen when the basic structure satisfies of these principles and citizens have good reasons for this. So what they are to try to do is to take into account the effect of this sort of public knowledge that citizens have of the principles that the parties accept in the original position. Now, it's also implicit in what I just said that we are to assume, as part of any agreement in the original position, that the parties agree on certain methods of inquiry and they agree on certain ways of reasoning to be followed when questions of political justice arise. Now you see, the reason for this is that we might agree on certain principles of justice or whatever, but if we don't agree on how evidence is to be collected and how we are to evaluate evidence, whether or not they are satisfied or what consequences they imply in certain particular cases, then we don't have really a helpful agreement. In other words, if people are going, if some people are going to have, let's say to have a bizarre example, are going to ask oracles how these principles should be applied, and others say, no, we have to consult past experience and say empirical evidence that we might gather by common sense. If we don't ask oracles, we go this other way. If they can't agree about how this evidence and application is to be done, well, then they don't have a workable agreement yet. So some understanding on how principles are to be applied and how the evidence is to be assessed for the consequences and so forth is a very important matter. And therefore I'm assuming that, although we haven't actually mentioned at that point before. So one does assume that there is some agreement on those matters. Now, the point then of the publicity condition is to require the parties to assess conceptions of political justice as public conceptions and everything that implies. So they have to assess the consequences of the public knowledge among citizens that these principles are accepted and so on. Now, the idea here is that there may be first principles which work well enough so long as they are not publicly recognized. Perhaps they are just followed. People may not be aware that they're following them, or there may be no public recognition of this fact, and so forth, but which, when they are made public, and they are used in public traditions of interpretations of institutions, have various psychological and other consequences. Indeed, they may have harmful and destructive consequences, and that's a relevant point. On the other hand, there may be other principles, quite different principles, the desirable features of which may importantly derive from the fact that they are publicly recognized and that they are used in the public traditions of the interpretation of political institutions. For example, by something like, take an obvious example, something like the Supreme Court in interpreting the Constitution, where I presume that those principles whereby they do that are, in this sense, public. Moreover, one has to take into account the fact that citizens in a democratic society, or in most any society, learn to conceive of themselves or to regard themselves as, say, free and equal citizens, or for that matter, in other ways, by the principles that are public and that are used in the case of political justice in their society. And these conceptions, then, of how people regard themselves are, I think, importantly learned and acquired and even, one might say, taught through their use as public political principles. At least that's the idea. So that's why that's an important consideration. And to get ahead a bit, the general idea is that the principle of average utility, even if constrained, has, when made public principle, certain undesirable consequences, or at any rate, not particularly desirable consequences, whereas the different principle when the public has desirable consequences, and indeed many of the desirable consequences of it depend upon its being used as a public political principle and understood in that way. So I'll make a few comments about the idea of reciprocity that's implicit. As I mentioned before, this is an idea that is important, and it enters in because we start from the idea, the most fundamental idea is that of a society is a fair system of cooperation between citizens that are conceived as free and equal persons. So that the idea of cooperation includes the idea of fair terms of cooperation, and the idea of fair terms of cooperation includes an idea of reciprocity or mutuality or mutual benefit or something of that sort. By contrast, I think that the principle of average utility, in whatever form, includes no such idea. It is a maximizing, aggregated principle with no inherent tendency to either equality or to reciprocity, and any such tendency in practice would depend on the consequences of applying that principle to institutions in these or those particular circumstances. There isn't any inherent tendency for it to have that result, although it might do so depending on particular cases. So we might observe in the following way how the notion of reciprocity might enter into the reasoning of the parties in the original position. The parties know in this second comparison, which is what I always have in mind, the parties know that the persons that they represent regard themselves as free and equal persons in a democratic society. I make that assumption because the prior principles that constrain the pursuit of average utility in this conception require a regime of that sort. I'm making that assumption. So that both alternatives in this comparison require that sort of society. So that from the publicity condition, the parties also know that the conception of justice that they agree to must be acceptable to citizens who think of themselves then as free and equal persons. And the conception of the person here is, of course, a political conception and not metaphysical or psychological or whatever. For simplicity, that is to simplify the argument a bit, suppose that we just think of the inequalities that we're concerned with are inequalities in the primary goods of income and wealth alone, and we regard the difference principle as regulating those inequalities. So we then say that since the parties are symmetrically situated in the original position, we're going to suppose that they take they take equal division of income and wealth as the starting point, and then they ask, well, what inequalities and for what reasons are going to be acceptable if we start from that position. In other words, the idea is that if we begin with parties as representatives of free and equal persons, then the idea is they imagine that they begin from equal division of these primary goods and ask whether there are good reasons for departing from that and what those reasons might be. Now, we discussed earlier the various reasons why any workable and plausible conception of justice must take into account the requirements of social organization and economic efficiency and all those things. And we've gone over that when earlier we discussed the difference principle and what it meant. So we then arrive at the difference principle in a natural way, taking equal division as a benchmark. Those who have gained more are to do so on terms that are acceptable to those who have gained less, and in particular those who gained the least. And that expresses the idea of reciprocity that is contained in the difference principle and in this conception I've called justice as fairness. And we mentioned earlier that it picks a point that is a natural focal point between equality, which is represented by the 45-degree line, and efficiency. Now, one way that parties might reason to put it, I might skip over this. I think it's easy enough, but I've given it on the sheet of how they might, beginning of from equal division, stating the same point in somewhat the same way. So suppose I go on to something else that brings in the force and relevance of the notion of publicity. But I'm supposing that what I have said so far gives a reason for why the parties might arrive at the difference principle via this idea of reciprocity. So we're going to try to introduce another reason. And the other reason, as I indicated earlier, is the desirable effects of its public recognition and of the public knowledge that it is satisfied in the well-ordered society that corresponds to this view. So the idea is that in this well-ordered society, there is a certain harmony of interest, social interest, that is ensured by the idea of reciprocity that is implicit in the difference principle. That is, that all differences in income and wealth are perceived as being in what is called on page 78 and 9 and elsewhere in the realm of positive contributions. That is, that everyone who has more is contributing something, taking equal position as a benchmark to those who have less. And that's a way of understanding, because obviously not the only way of understanding, but a way of understanding what the notion of social harmony of interest might mean, and that this, of course, this is speculation, but the idea is that this strengthens social ties and reduces socially divisive antagonism and strains. Now, we can express this reasoning more formally by comparing the average utility in the well-ordered society of justice and fairness at the point selected by the difference principle with the average utility of the well-ordered society that it corresponds to the principle of constrained utility. That's at the point, say, on the OP curve, or say some point B, which is to the right of the highest point, some point B, where you B for Bentham, at which average utility is maximized subject to these constraints. Now, if this comparison is first made in terms of average utility, insofar as average utility is discussed or evaluated only in terms of income and wealth, why then the average utility of the society that corresponds to the principle of constrained utility might be higher. It might be the higher of the two, that is higher than the one that corresponds to the difference principle. Suppose that is the case. But the idea is that once the effects of the public recognition of the respective principles of the two well-ordered societies is taken into account, then the average utility of the well-ordered society that corresponds with the two principles, justice and the difference principle, would turn out to be higher than the average utility of the society of constrained utility. And the explanation for this would be that citizens on balance would benefit from the public recognition of the harmony of social interest, which is established by the difference principle and which is perceived, and then the absence of the divisions and so forth in public life that presumably result from this kind of speculation that one is making. So that the initial estimate of average utility for the well-ordered society that corresponds to the principle of constrained utility would then fall or decrease sufficiently once these other kinds of grounds are taken into account, that the parties on balance, since they have to take into reckoning the interests of both the more and the least advantage, and they have to do that impartially, they would then agree on the difference principle. And the idea would be that you generalize these kinds of arguments. You try to find other cases where you can say somewhat the same kind of thing. And the case that I will go into a bit more on Friday, the case of self-respect, would then tie in with the notion of society as a social union, and how the two principles of justice would make that possible. I don't say that particularly likely, but at any rate, could make it possible. Now, as a final point, the third consideration that I mentioned at the beginning was that, and although I can't go into this very much, is that the concept of utility, I think, is unworkable to use that in any extended way in a conception of political justice. And I'll try to make a few observations about this. So the argument that they've been making so far is a concession, because what Justice Fairness would maintain is that the idea of utility, understood as the fulfillment of a person's, say, final ends and interests, cannot be used to specify a workable principle of political justice in a modern democratic society. And this is because, I think, of the plurality of conceptions of the good that are espoused and that are followed in that kind of society. It's also involved in the fact that these conceptions of the good are conflicting and they're incommensurable. Now, of course, have in mind that among the things that we call conceptions of the good are religious, moral, and philosophical views about how life is to be lived and so forth, and various things that count as good. And because that's so, it's impossible to establish within a political conception, again I keep emphasizing that, a reasonable basis for interpersonal comparisons. That is, it's just, I think, not possible on a comprehensive basis, say to arrive at any estimate that you could use for political purposes, whether or not people are happier having certain kinds of religious views or not. One might have opinions on that, or whether people are happier having certain kind of philosophical or moral views or not. And thinking of these always as some comprehensive conception of the good. I don't think it would be possible to get agreement on the degrees of happiness, worthwhileness of human life across all those conceptions on a political basis. And the reason I think is this, is that a political conception of justice involves some public agreement as to which claims on social resources are legitimate. It also involves some agreement as to how much strength different claims are to have. And people are likely to recognize the strength of these claims on a political basis only if they can share and have some understanding about what these claims are being claimed in behalf of, and some agreement as to what is accounted as good for political purposes. Now, I believe that the only kind of conception of the good that will prove to be workable is one that one might say is partial conception of the good. That is to say, a conception of the good of the kind that I have described here occasionally as based on the notion of primary goods. And basic idea, which I will develop some on Friday, and which I have developed elsewhere in an article called Social Unity and Primary Good, which I will put on reserve in Robin's library and elsewhere. If you are interested in that, is this, that we've developed the view that certain kinds of all-purpose means or objective features of social institutions are the kinds of things that if we regard people as we regard them within the political conception of the person, that people as citizens will then need. So among the primary goods will be the basic rights and liberties. There will be opportunities, and there will be things like, and the ones I have mentioned today, income and wealth, and also things that we'll characterize on Friday as the social bases of self-respect. And those kinds of things are then can be identified objectively as features of institutions or as all-purpose means for fulfilling all kinds of ends, say not any kind of end, but for almost all kinds of ends, and presumably everyone needs those. And so they can be defined as the needs of citizens within, let's say, partial conception of the good. And we don't have to have any agreement about how to evaluate and how to assess all these conceptions of the good in any comprehensive way. So the argument then for something like primary goods as opposed to some kind of interpersonal comparisons that you would have on a utilitarian view is that the latter proves to be, I think, not workable, cannot be done. One could not expect political agreement on it within a society in which you have a variety of conflicting and incommensurable conceptions of the good. So the result is, I think, that within a democratic state of this kind, that social unity needs to be based in the first instance on some political conception of justice, and not on a comprehensive notion of the good. Well, that's the end of the time there, so I'll stop. This at the end is quite a complicated subject. It's quite important, and I think one way in which T.J. was lacking is that it was too accommodating in this respect. It should have carried out and explained in more detail this kind of criticism of the utilitarian and other analogous views. Oh yes, there's a handout.